Hello, everybody. Welcome to my talk on the value of debriefing every flight, both in the sim and in the air. This is a talk we're given for Redbird's virtual migration in 2020. My name is Ty Shuff. I am the customer liaison at Ahoy. My role here is to work directly with our customers to solicit feedback to help solve the issues that they may or may not be having with our tool. To also do a lot of our internal testing, write documentation, do training sessions like these, and pretty much anything that doesn't involve software development directly. I currently am a private pilot with an instrument rating. I've been flying for about 4 or 5 years. I've had my instrument rating for 2 years. I'm actually coming up on my very first ever BFR at the beginning of next year. You're welcome to reach out to me if you have any questions or comments. My email address is ty@cloudahoy.com. And I'll have some more information at the end of this presentation to how to reach out to our team and engage us for anything that you might need. As a New England-based pilot, I find myself several months out of the year where maintaining IFR currency is only possible with either a safety pilot or in a certified simulator. In general, my flying, like many people, tends to taper off, and I find that I would rather maintain currency and proficiency inside a warm building in a simulator rather than outside in a sub-freezing airplane. Anyone who knows me will tell you that I'm a firm believer in the use of simulation. I have a home sim setup that I fly several times a week and several certified simulators that are in my general area. Not far from me is a Redbird FMX simulator owned by Wings Level Aviation in Norwood, Massachusetts that I started using last year to help me maintain my instrument currency. As a weekend warrior, I want to maximize the value that I get out of my flying, both in the real plane and in the sim. By debriefing every flight with Ahoy, I'm able to get the most out of my time that I spend engaged with aviation and work to make myself both a better and safer pilot. So let's talk about what's going to happen. We're going to talk a little bit about what Ahoy is, and then I'm going to have a big section on actually using Ahoy and talk about the value that you can get out of Ahoy, and then just sort of wrap things up a little bit. So let's talk about what Ahoy is. Ahoy is a tool for performing data-driven post-flight debriefs. We take data from a variety of different sources. You can record data with your iOS apps. You can record data with ForeFlight. You can record data directly from avionics. We take that data, we combine it, and we merge it with information about aerodromes, published approaches, wind speed data, and other information. And then we analyze that data, performing segmentation on it, dividing it up into its pieces, and then also attempting to score maneuvers and provide you with an understanding of how well you did or did not fly. The power of Ahoy is our automatic segmentation, though. We take a flight that you send us, take a flight path, and we divide it up into its individual pieces. We can look at steep turns and identify steep turns. We can identify slow flight sections, approaches, and as a focus today, we can also identify instrument approaches. Our engine is capable of scoring those maneuvers and scoring those approaches to help both instructors and pilots to identify approaches and maneuvers that maybe need a little bit of extra work. And then we combine this all together in our powerful visualization engine, where we give you the opportunity to relive and look at your flight in 2D and 3D, as well as providing you access to the raw data directly through graphs and other means. I mentioned a little bit about automatic scoring. So our scoring engine is aimed at providing objective evaluation of proficiency and safety. We are not trying to replace a human CFI. Our goal is to say, these are the things that we have identified that you could work on, and a CFI will say, this is how we're going to work on them and how we're going to fix them. Automatic scoring is a feature that is included with the pro level subscription of Ahoy. So to sign up for Ahoy, for those of you that have not used it, you can head over to our website. We do have 2 tiers of subscription, Ahoy Pro and Ahoy Standard. We also have a Ahoy Track version that is a free version that lets you log your flights and then debrief them with more power later if you decide to subscribe. All users who sign up with Ahoy get a 35-day free trial of Ahoy Pro, and there's no credit card that's required to do that. So when you have a Cloud Ahoy account, what you can do is you can actually connect it to your Redbird account. And when you set up a Redbird account and you create your pilot key and you connect that to Cloud Ahoy, whenever you insert your pilot key into the Redbird sim and you fly a flight, as soon as you're finished, your flight will automatically be uploaded to Cloud Ahoy. It'll be immediately ready to debrief by the time you step out of the simulator. If you would like to see more information about how to do that, I'm not going to walk you through that today, but you can head over to our help section and find our lovely article that I wrote and get some information about making that happen. But this is sort of the core of what's going to enable what we talk about today. So this is Cloud Ahoy. In this particular view, we have an instrument approach that we're looking at, and we'll cover it in a little bit more depth here in a little bit. We have our 2D view in the upper left corner. We have our 3D view in the upper right corner. And we also have our graph view in the very bottom section that'll also give us more information to the data. On the left side, we have some aspects of our user interface that show us approaches and maneuvers that were scored, as well as the segments that we identified in our segment manager. On the iPad, we have a very similar view. However, on the iPad, we've optimized this for touch. And there is a similarly optimized version for phones as well. In the iPad, you can split your pane. You can have two different views up here, and you get all the access to all the powerful stuff that you have on the desktop on your tablet as well. So let's move into using Cloud Ahoy. Today, we're going to talk about 3 different flights. These are all of my own flights. I like to talk about my flights when I give these talks because it's easier for me to be more critical of myself than it is to be of others. 2 of the flights I flew in a Redbird FMX simulator, and 1 of the flights I flew in the real world. The first Redbird flight was the Long Beach Proficiency 365 scenario, which had us flying into the Long Beach airport pretty much down to minimums. The second was a scenario that I built going into my local airport where I flew an ILS approach. And the last flight we're going to talk about is a real-world currency flight, just to reiterate that Cloud Ahoy works in both the real world and in simulators. One of Cloud Ahoy's goals is to help pilots, instructors, and flight schools maximize the value of the time spent in airplanes and simulators. Thanks to recent changes in the FAA currency rules, a CFI is no longer required to be present when building currency in a certified sim. This doesn't mean, however, that pilots shouldn't use these sessions as a learning opportunity. Debriefing a flight without a CFI will give pilots access to powerful scoring of approaches and hold them more accountable for their actions. Doing this with every flight will enable pilots to identify trends in their flying and will produce a list of topics to discuss the next time that they meet with their CFI. On the flip side, when flying with a CFI in the sim, using Cloud Ahoy to debrief will enable the pilots and CFIs to immediately review an approach and discuss areas of improvements and areas of excellence. After the debrief, another scenario can be immediately loaded, and the process can be repeated in quick succession. This is a huge advantage of using sims over the real airplane. So knowing that, let's talk about one of my first approaches. This is the Long Beach EAA Proficiency 365 scenario. It's called Deep Practice, and it's going to have me flying the ILS 30 with a hold. As I click on the link, we're going to load into Cloud Ahoy. And as we load into Cloud Ahoy, I have set this view up so that we have on the top left here our 2D view of the flight. On the top right here, we have a 3D cockpit view that provides us with an idea of what the plane was doing at a point in time. It also gives us access to some instrumentation on the left side. And on the bottom, we have our graph showing us our airspeed in blue and our altitude in green. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab onto this graph here and just sort of start scrubbing through it. And the hold I flew, I was relatively happy with. And what I really want to just look at is I want to quickly look at this approach itself. So I'm going to scrub through this flight, and I'm going to use the 2D view to say, where am I in relation to the localizer, which is noted in purple here, or pink, magenta, whatever color we want to call it. And then on the 3D view, I'm going to look at the glide slope and my relation to that same path and say, okay, was I over controlling the airplane? Was I holding that center line fairly well? And we can just sort of quickly scrub through the flight as we cross the final approach fix gunny and start making our way down. We'll see that in blue, the airspeed's holding a little bit on the slow side. I look for 90 knots here. I'd like to be closer to 90, but I'm actually closer to 80 right now. The green line is tracking along the glide slope pretty well. And as I scrub a little bit quicker, I can see, well, I'm actually following fairly close to the center of that line on my 3D view in the upper right corner. And then we get to a section here that is highlighted in red on the graph down below. So the goal is to maintain around 90 knots for the approach. And this is a section where I actually went a little bit fast. Only 1 or 2 knots. It's something that we may want to look at, but it's worth noting at least that I did go above my target speed. Also, we were a little bit above the glide slope as we're coming down, but overall the approach was flown fairly well. And so one of the things that we can do is we can once again grab this line here. We can just quickly scrub through the flight and take a look at our 3D cockpit view. And if there was any over controlling or if there was any amount of oscillation that was happening as we scrub through this flight very quickly, we would get a good feel for that. But overall, I feel like this approach was flown fairly well. I was very happy with it. So I mentioned a little bit about gauges in that 3D cockpit view. And one of the advantages of using a Redbird simulator along with some real world avionics packages is that in the debrief, we get access to rich data. This data is things like the indicated airspeed. It's going to be the G readings. It could be the RPM settings, the power settings coming off the engine. There's a whole lot of data that we can get access to, and a whole lot of data that we can use to really make that debrief powerful. So for this next debrief, I want to cover a simulated flight I did into one of my local airports, Lawrence, and we're gonna briefly show you the approach as we did before. But I'm going to show you a little bit about some of the rich data that we can get out of the sim. Most importantly, we're going to talk about the RPM setting of the engine. This is the ILS 5 with another hold going into Lawrence. And again, this is a flight into my local airport, so it's one that I'm fairly familiar with, and it's nice to once in a while just go in and kind of have one of these that you're familiar with. So again, on this time on our left side, we have our 3D a 3D track view where I can zoom in and I can kind of pan around and I can really see this flight. I'm going to go ahead and overlay the instrument approach here. So before I talk about the rich data, one of the first things that I would look at is how straight was I coming down the chute? Well, in this case, I definitely had some oscillation that was happening. The brown track is my plane. The magenta track was my target. And you can see that there was a point here towards the end where I started chasing that needle as that ILS and that localizer, as the glide slope and the localizer started getting more and more sensitive. You can see that I'm kind of oscillating a little bit back and forth. So that's definitely the first thing I noticed and the first thing that I would want to take a look at. I'll grab my plane. I'll start scrubbing through. We'll set the view down here to be a 3D cockpit view so we can better visualize that. And now we can talk a little bit about some of the rich data that we have. On the left side here, we have our flight graphs. And our flight graphs will give us access to all of that data that's being logged. If you were to look at this with a G1000, you would see cylinder head temperatures. You would see oil pressure gauges. You'd see all sorts of other instrumentation as well. In the case of the Redbird sim, we're showing what's important in the simulator. So I want to look at my power setting or my RPM setting as well. So I clicked on RPM. I'm looking over here on the left side, and now I have a graph that shows me my RPMs. Bring that out so it's a little easier to see. So if we were working with, if we were a pilot looking to improve how we're handling the airplane on the approach, or if we're a CFI, maybe working with a pilot who's a little handsy on the throttles, this would be one way where we could visualize what we were doing with our power setting. Were we going to, were we oscillating the RPMs? Or did we do fairly well? In this case, I set my power to about 2100 RPMs and I just let it go. Now, as we're coming down the chute, we can look at the airspeed and altitude graphs, and we can see that, well, maybe I should have pulled that power back a little bit more. By keeping that consistent power setting, I was oscillating my speed up and down. So maybe that's a case where I should have taken another 50 or 100 RPMs out and let that speed come down a touch. We also can once again look at our visualization of our lateral line here, and we can see that there was some chasing of the needle. If I close this graph out and I take a look at the 3D view in the bottom left corner, we can quickly scrub and we can actually see that. We can see back and forth and back and forth. Or I can go all the way back and I can say, let's just actually play this in real time, and we'll make it nice and fast. And as soon as we make this we start to play back really quickly, we can really start to see those adjustments that are happening. We'll see changes to our RPM settings that are happening. We'll see changes to our airspeed, our altitude, and we'll see that oscillation back and back and forth until we execute our missed approach. I was fairly happy with that flight though, but there was certainly some things. The chasing of that localizer was something that I definitely went and talked to a CFI about when I was finished. So one of the other things that Cloud Ahoy can do for instructors and sim centers is provide pilots with the opportunity to share their flights. Cloud Ahoy enables pilots to record their flights and share their debriefs with anyone, including an instructor. This feature can allow pilots to fly on their own time and then engage with their CFIs after the fact. With the use of rich data, which we just showed you, an instructor can debrief a flight themselves almost as if they were in the cockpit with the student or the pilot. With the pandemic raging, this gives a great opportunity for instructors to engage with pilots in a remote capacity. It also ties in very well with the remote instruction initiatives that Redbird has recently kicked off. So moving on, let's talk a little bit more about scoring. Early on, we received feedback from instructors who were skeptical and believed that Cloud Ahoy was trying to replace them altogether by putting CFI Assistant out there. CFI Assistant, however, does not intend to replace the CFI. We would rather provide you with an objective look at the flight and help you and your pilots identify areas of improvement quickly. A good friend of Cloud Ahoy and advisor, Nate Weinsaft, very experienced instructor, has to say that an experienced instructor, once said that the CFI assistant will tell the story of what happened on a flight, and an instructor will say, this is why it happened. So the instructor is still very important to have present because they can say, well, we see the factors that went into the approach, and this is what happened with you. You were over controlling. You were, any of the other factors, any of the other things that could go into that. So, talking about CFI Assistant, then the final flight I want to look at is one of a real-world currency flight that I did. I flew 6 approaches in this particular flight, and in here we will use our CFI Assistant to identify a couple of approaches and see how well I did and where I needed to improve. There's a few approaches that we'll be able to just immediately jump to and see. So I flew all 6 approaches in this. An instructor described me as crazy for this, but it felt really good to get up and do that flying after being away for a bit due to all the stuff that's going on in the world. So this is a local flight around my neck of the woods. I live in eastern Massachusetts. And I flew up to the Portsmouth airport. I did some approaches in Portsmouth. I did some airports in another small field around there, and then back here to my local area. So if we look at CFI Assistant on the upper left-hand corner here, we can see all the approaches and we can see what their scores were. In general, I flew them pretty well. And I will say that I also felt pretty good in the cockpit. There was one approach, though, that I remember in the cockpit saying, man, this one doesn't feel great. I felt like I was a little bit behind. I felt like I was not tracking super well. And in general, when I finished it, I talked to my safety pilot, and we both agreed that there's probably could use some work. And that happened to be the RNAV 33 going into DAW, which when we look at CFI Assistant was actually the lowest scoring of the approaches, an 86 in the green, but still room for improvement. So if I click on that approach and pull it up, and we'll go ahead and declutter that approach so that we only show that particular approach. We'll pull it in here and we'll frame it up real nicely and see what happens. So the first issue is, well, I overshot the final approach. So I didn't turn in fast enough. I didn't get the plane moving in fast enough. So we started off in a less than ideal way, we'll say. And as we look at the graphs, as we go ahead and hit play, and we'll start playing this back. And then we'll take a look at the segment information view in the upper right-hand corner, and we'll see that the airspeed was kind of wavering a little bit. We'd be 110 knots. We'd be down to 105 knots. So there were definitely some issues with airspeed control as I was getting myself established and as I was coming in. And if we go ahead and scrub a little bit further forward, now I'm at a point where I'd like to be on a final approach path or a descent path. And watching the little green line as we head down the approach path here, there were times when I was above it. There were times when I was below it. And my speed was still wavering quite a bit as I'm coming in. So I can say that this particular approach, prior to the final approach fix even, was already starting off less than ideal, we'll say. Not unsafe, not a huge problem, but when I think about proficiency and currency and all the things I'd like to get out of a flight, it's certainly not not what I had in mind. And these are why I debrief my own. These are why I talk about my own flights in these sessions as well, because it's easier for me to be hard on myself. So I moved the cursor forward to the final approach fix. So now we're coming in on final, and in the 3D view on the right side, we can see I'm sitting a little bit left of center. I'm a little bit right of center, so I'm holding it fairly well, but I'm still oscillating back. One little bit. It was about a half a bubble or so, or half a dot though, back and forth and back and forth. So that was an area that I needed for improvement. If I take a look at my speeds, as we're coming through 1,000 feet, I'm at 88 knots, 89 knots. So down to 85 knots almost. So the speeds were not really holding 90 quite in the way that I'd like to. There was a little bit of wind. There was a little bit of wind shift that was happening as we came down. But speed control was definitely one of the core issues I felt I had during this flight. And it was definitely confirmed when I went to look at the debrief. And as we sort of look at the end of this approach here, as we're coming in on final, we see a pretty solid deviation from the center line, an attempt to catch up, a little bit of an overcorrect, and then finally down to minimums, and we execute the missed approach, and off we go. So while it scored well, and again, it wasn't an unsafe approach or anything, I definitely didn't feel great about that approach. And it was easy to find that, because it was, not only did I not feel great about it, but it was the lowest scoring approach in the mix here as well. So if we go ahead and then fast forward to the very end of this flight, my last approach going back into my home airport at Beverly, and we'll start playing that back. Our camera set up all nicely here. I felt a lot better about this particular approach. So I've flown a couple more approaches since this point. I was starting to feel better in the cockpit. I'm a weekend warrior, so it's 4, 5, 6 hours a month. And aside from getting a little bit slow here as I crossed the final approach fix, everything about this approach looked fairly good. There were some issues with speed control. Speed was up, speed was down. So if I had to think about one thing to work on coming out of this, it would probably be speed management from the final approach in. But again, there was some oscillation back and forth, pretty minor. But I felt pretty good about that approach. So as a whole, Cloud Ahoy gave me my sort of list of things to work on, and I went back into my simulator and I made sure that I was pitch power and roll, and just keeping my airplane in a good place, and so that hopefully next time when I go up and do these approaches again for currency or for real, that we'll be closer to the center line. And it was an excellent opportunity to reach out to some CFI friends of mine as well, and have them remotely help me out with some of the things I may have encountered. So that flight was recorded with GPS position only. Having rich data available for our debriefs is fantastic and gives us access to a lot of information that we may not otherwise have had. But you can record a flight just by having a phone and a window mount. Using GPS only positioning with either the Cloud Ahoy app or ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot or any other number of tools, we can get information into Cloud Ahoy and we can perform a comprehensive debrief on that information. Cloud Ahoy will attempt to estimate things like the indicated airspeed, the pitch and the roll, the yaw of the plane, by using the computed ground speed and comparing that with forecasted winds aloft. So we'll attempt to say, well, you were at 70 knots ground speed, and compared to the winds and everything else, all the other factors, it looks like you should have been about 65 knots indicated. And I find that number is generally very, very accurate. So it's nice to be able to go out and just fly, and once again debrief every single flight that we do. So to wrap things up then, in summary, using Cloud Ahoy to debrief flight increases the value pilots get from real-world and simulated flying. It does this by helping pilots identify trends, repeated mistakes, bad habits, as well as reinforcing things they did well. Cloud Ahoy is a tool with the ultimate goal of creating better and safer pilots. I want to extend... Oh, sorry. I wanted to show information about signing up again. If you are interested in trying out Cloud Ahoy, if you have not before, you can head over to cloudahoy.com. Again, we have 2 tiers available to all of our customers. And there's also a free tier where you can start recording flights immediately. And for all folks who sign up with a new email address, we offer a 35-day free trial of Cloud Ahoy Pro, and there is no credit card required to do that. So I want to take a moment to extend a big thanks to Redbird for hosting us this week. For those of you tuning in during the event, Cloud Ahoy will also be hosting a virtual coffee break on Thursday morning. We would love to connect with as many of you as possible and look forward to seeing you there. You can also reach out to us. You can reach out to me directly, ty@cloudahoy.com, or reach out to our team via team@cloudahoy.com. Any requests go into our ticket system, and I'm oftentimes the first person that ends up addressing anything that comes in. You can also click the feedback button on any one of your flights in the upper left-hand corner, and we will do our best to help with that. You can also get help with our tool by heading over to help.cloudahoy.com. I encourage you, if you notice anything with a debrief that seems amiss or that you like, hit the feedback button and please let us know. Feedback is very, very important to what we do. It helps us to tune our algorithms and tune our scoring and make them as close to perfect as possible. So thank you all again for your time, and hopefully we will see you on Thursday morning at the coffee break. Thank you so much.